The sun-baked surface of Kepler 22 billion shimmered in the heat as a group of miners trudged across its rocky terrain. Despite the planet's contested status, the lure of rare minerals had drawn prospectors from across human space. "I'm telling you, Jace, there's something weird going on with the sensors," said Maria, a geologist, frowning at her handheld device. Jace, the expedition leader, wiped sweat from his brow. "Weird how?" Before Maria could answer, the ground beneath them trembled. A blinding flash of light erupted from over the next ridge, followed by a shockwave that knocked them off their feet. "What the hell was that?" Jace shouted, scrambling to his feet. Maria's eyes widened as she stared at her sensor readings. I've never seen energy signatures like this. It's off the charts." Suddenly, their comms crackled to life with an urgent message from base camp. "All teams, return immediately. We're picking up massive gravitational disturbances. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Aboard the UNSC Horizon, new addition to the team and newly promoted Major Sam Buff stood before a holographic display of Kepler 22 billion, his cybernetic implants glowing as he processed the incoming data. He wasn't sure if he liked the idea of replacing the heroes that he was replacing in the squad, but he still felt proud to do so. He had been close friends with Torres and Chen before all of this, the war and all. "Major," a junior officer called out, "we're receiving a priority transmission from command." Buff nodded, his face grim. "Put it through." The hologram shifted, revealing the stern visage of Admiral Krusov. "Major Buff, we have a situation on Kepler 22 billion. An antimatter anomaly has been detected, and we believe it's from one of our ejected cores." Buff felt a chill run down his spine. He remembered all too well the volatile nature of their antimatter technology. "How bad is it, Admiral?" "Bad enough that I'm sending in your team," McDermott replied. "The anomaly is growing, and we've detected proximate activity in the sector. You need to secure or neutralize that core before they get their hands on it." "Understood, Admiral. We'll drop within the hour." As the transmission ended, Buff turned to his team. They were a mix of veterans and rookies, all eyeing him expectantly. "All right, Marines," he began, his voice carrying the weight of command. "We've got a rogue antimatter core on Kepler 22 billion. It's creating some kind of anomaly, and you can bet the proxies are racing us to it. This is what we've trained for." He looked each of them in the eye, seeing determination reflected back. "Gear up. We drop in 30. The next half hour was a flurry of activity as the Antimatter Marines prepared for deployment. Specialized suits were checked and double-checked, weapons were calibrated, and last-minute intelligence was absorbed. As they boarded the dropship, Buff felt the familiar mix of anticipation and dread. Every mission could be their last, but this one felt different. They weren't just fighting proximate forces this time, they were up against the very technology that made them so formidable. The dropship's engines roared to life, and Buff gave the order launch. They shot out of the Horizon's bay, streaking towards the turbulent atmosphere of Kepler 22 billion. As they descended, the ship bucked and shuddered, buffeted by strange gravitational eddies. "This is no normal storm," muttered Lieutenant Kira Sato, the team's science officer. "The anomaly is affecting the entire planet's gravitational field." They broke through the cloud cover, and Buff got his first look at the situation on the ground. The mining colony was in chaos, with people running for shelter as inexplicable phenomena manifested around them. Objects floated in midair, defying gravity. Temporal distortions caused plants to grow and wither in seconds. And there, at the center of it all, was the anomaly. A swirling vortex of energy, pulsing with a light that hurt to look at directly. It was a rip in the very fabric of space-time, and it was growing. As the dropship touched down, Buff steeled himself. This was going to be unlike any mission they'd faced before. "Antimatter Marines," he called out, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation, "move out. Let's go save a planet." With that, they stepped out into the chaos of Kepler 22 billion, the fate of the colony and perhaps much more resting on their shoulders. The Antimatter Marines fanned out from their landing zone, the chaos of Kepler 22 billion's compromised environment immediately apparent. Lieutenant Sato's sensors whirred frantically, trying to make sense of the readings. Major Sato called out, her voice tense. The anomaly is putting out levels of radiation I've never seen before. Our suits can handle it for now, but I'm not sure for how long. Buff nodded grimly. Understood. Jackson, Reyes, secure the perimeter. Sato with me. We need to get closer to that thing. As they approached the swirling vortex of energy, the effects became more pronounced. Gravity fluctuated wildly. One moment they were struggling to move forward, the next they were at risk of floating away. It's definitely one of ours, Buff confirmed, his cybernetic implants interfacing with the residual signature of the antimatter core. Must have been ejected during the Proximan ambush last month. Sato's face paled behind her visor. Sir, if my calculations are correct, this anomaly is growing exponentially. At this rate, it could engulf the entire planet within 72 hours. Before Buff could respond, his comm crackled to life. Major, it was Corporal Reyes, her voice urgent. We've got incoming. Proximan ships just dropped out of FTL. Buff swore under his breath. Earlier than expected. All right, team, change of plans. Sato, keep working on a way to neutralize this thing. Jackson, Reyes, you're with me. We need to set up defenses before those Proximans make planetfall. The next few hours were a blur of frenetic activity. Half the team worked on rigging up a containment field around the anomaly, using modified antimatter tech to create a bubble of stable spacetime. The other half, led by Buff, prepared for the impending Proximan assault. They'd just finished setting up the last of their defensive positions when the sky lit up with the telltale flashes of atmospheric entry. Here they come, Buff muttered, hefting his antimatter rifle. Remember your training, Marines. We hold this line, no matter what. The first wave of Proximan drop pods slammed into the ground about a click from their position. As the alien soldiers emerged, their insectoid forms eerily graceful despite the chaotic environment, Buff couldn't help but admire their adaptability. Open fire, he commanded, and the air was filled with the distinctive whine of antimatter weapons. The battle that ensued was like nothing Buff had ever experienced. The fluctuating gravity and sporadic time dilation effects from the anomaly turned the battlefield into a surreal, ever-changing landscape. One moment, a Proximan soldier would be charging forward. The next it would age decades in seconds, crumbling to dust. Major Sato's voice cut through the din of battle. The containment field isn't holding. The anomaly is growing too fast. Buff ducked behind cover as a Proximan energy blast sizzled overhead. Can you stabilize it? Not without getting closer, Sato replied, frustration evident in her voice. But if we don't do something soon, none of this will matter. The whole planet's going to be swallowed up. Buff made a split-second decision. Reyes, you're in charge here. Hold them off as long as you can. Sato, you're with me. We're going in. As Buff and Sato fought their way towards the anomaly, the situation grew increasingly dire. The containment field flickered and failed, and the swirling vortex of antimatter energy expanded rapidly. They were mere meters away when Buff saw a sleek, alien device being set up by a group of Proximan scientists. His blood ran cold as he realized what it was. Sato, look, he shouted over the roar of battle. They're trying to harness the anomaly's power. Before they could react, a blinding flash of light erupted from the Proximan device. The anomaly pulsed and suddenly expanded outward in a wave of indescribable energy. Buff felt a moment of weightlessness, then a sickening lurch as reality itself seemed to twist around him. The last thing he saw before blackness took him was Sato reaching out, her face a mask of terror, as the wave of energy engulfed them both. As consciousness faded, one thought echoed in Buff's mind: they were out of time, and the fate of Kepler 22 billion, perhaps the entire sector, now hung by a thread. Major Buff awoke to a world gone mad. The landscape around him defied description. Fragments of Kepler 22 billion's terrain floated in a swirling maelstrom of energy, time, and space. Nearby, Lieutenant Sato was stirring, her armor systems flickering as they tried to adapt to the impossible environment. Sato, you all right? Buff called out, his voice distorted by the strange physics of their surroundings. I think so, sir, she responded, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. Where are we? Buff's cybernetic implants buzzed, struggling to process the influx of contradictory data. If I had to guess, we're inside the anomaly, some kind of pocket dimension created by the antimatter core. Their comms crackled to life, Corporal Reyes' voice barely audible through the static. Major, Lieutenant, do you copy? What's your status? We're alive, Reyes Buff responded. But we're somewhere else. The anomaly's expanded. What's the situation out there? It's bad, Sir Reyes replied, tension evident in her voice. The anomaly's growth has accelerated. We're holding off the Proximans for now, but we can't keep this up much longer. As Buff and Sato exchanged grim looks, a new voice joined the channel, young, nervous, but determined. It was Private McDermott, the team's rookie. Sir, I think I might have an idea. If we can't contain the anomaly, maybe we can collapse it. Outside the anomaly, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Reyes and the remaining Marines fought desperately against waves of Proximan forces, all while the expanding anomaly threatened to engulf everything. Private McDermott worked feverishly, repurposing their antimatter equipment under Reyes' protection. If we can create a resonance cascade, he explained, we might be able to destabilize the anomaly from the inside and outside simultaneously. Inside the pocket dimension, Buff and Sato battled against the chaotic effects of the antimatter core, fighting to reach its epicenter. Time flowed strangely. Sometimes they felt like they were moving through molasses. Other times they'd blink and find themselves meters away from where they'd been. There, Sato shouted, pointing at a pulsing sphere of energy suspended in the chaos. That has to be the core. As they approached, they saw they weren't alone. A group of Proximan soldiers had also been caught in the anomaly's expansion, and they were converging on the core as well. Looks like the fight's not over yet, Buff growled, raising his weapon. What followed was a battle unlike any other in human history. Human and Proximan forces clashed in a realm where the laws of physics were more suggestion than rule. Antimatter weapons collided with alien energy beams, creating explosions that rippled through space and time. Outside, McDermott's plan was put into motion. The remaining Marines positioned themselves around the anomaly's perimeter, their modified antimatter devices humming ominously. On my mark, Reyes shouted. 3, 2, 1 now. Inside the anomaly, Buff and Sato had finally reached the core, fighting off the last of the Proximan forces. As they prepared to neutralize it, they felt the pocket dimension shudder. That's our cue, Buff said. Let's end this. With a synchronized motion, they activated their own resonance devices. The core pulsed, then began to vibrate violently. The world around them started to collapse. Fragments of reality rushed past as the pocket dimension began to fold in on itself. Buff grabbed Sato's hand, anchoring them together as the chaos intensified. Hold on, he shouted, though his voice was lost in the maelstrom. In a final, cataclysmic implosion, the anomaly collapsed. A shock wave of energy rippled across Kepler 22 billion's surface, knocking both human and Proximan forces off their feet. As the dust settled, an eerie silence fell over the battlefield. Where the swirling vortex of the anomaly had been, there was now only a smoking crater. Reyes approached the edge cautiously, her heart in her throat. Major? Lieutenant? Do you copy? For a long moment, there was only static. Then, faintly, a voice came through. This is Buff. We're alive. Mission accomplished. A cheer went up from the Marines. They had done it. The anomaly was neutralized, the planet saved, and the Proximan forces were in retreat. But as medics rushed to extract Buff and Sato from the crater, it was clear that the ordeal had left its mark. The two Marines stared with haunted eyes, forever changed by their experience in the heart of the antimatter anomaly. And deep beneath the surface of Kepler 22 billion, unnoticed by scanners, a tiny flicker of anomalous energy pulsed quietly, waiting. The antimatter Marines had won the day, but the war was far from over. And the universe, it seemed, still had plenty of surprises in store for them. The medical frigate UNSS Mercy floated silently in high orbit around Kepler 22 billion, its sleek white hull a stark contrast to the battle-scarred planet below. Inside, the corridors bustled with activity as medical staff rushed to treat the wounded from the grueling battle against the antimatter anomaly and the Proximan forces. In a crowded triage bay, the members of the Antimatter Marines lay on biobeds, their bodies battered and broken from their ordeal. Major Buff winced as a medic carefully removed pieces of his cybernetic implants, many of which had been fried by the intense energy of the anomaly. "Easy there, Doc," he grunted, his voice hoarse. "I'm gonna need those put back eventually." Nearby, Lieutenant Sato lay motionless, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The exposure to the anomaly's time-warping effects had aged parts of her body erratically. Streaks of gray ran through her hair, and her left arm looked decades older than her right. The doctors were still unsure how to treat her unique condition. Corporal Reyes occupied the bed next to Sato, her armor having been cut away to reveal severe plasma burns across her torso and legs. The Proximan weapons had nearly overwhelmed their defenses in the final push. "How's McDermott?" Reyes asked, turning her head with effort to look at Buff. Buff's face darkened. "Still in surgery. The kid took the brunt of that last explosion. They're not sure if he'll make it." The rookie's bravery in implementing the plan to collapse the anomaly had saved them all, but at a terrible cost. The resonance cascade had backfired, catching McDermott in a blast that had nearly torn him apart. A grim silence fell over the team, broken only by the beeping of medical equipment and the distant hum of the ship's engines. Finally, Sato spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Was it worth it? What we went through, what we saw in there?" Buff met her gaze, seeing the haunted look in her eyes that he knew was mirrored in his own. "We saved the planet, stopped the Proximans from getting their hands on tech that could have turned the tide of the war. But at what cost?" Reyes finished for him. Before Buff could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the medical bay. Medical staff rushed past their beds towards the oar. "What's happening?" Buff demanded, trying to sit up despite the pain. A passing nurse paused long enough to answer. "It's your teammate, the young one. He's crashing. They're losing him." As the team watched helplessly, more doctors rushed into the oar, where McDermott was fighting for his life. The alarms continued to wail, a grim reminder of how close they all were to the edge. Buff lay back on his bed, a mix of emotions washing over him. They had accomplished their mission, neutralized a threat that could have destroyed entire worlds. But the price had been almost too high to bear. As the medical staff prepared them for their own surgeries, Buff couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed, not just for them, but perhaps for the entire course of the war. The antimatter anomaly had shown them glimpses of realities they were never meant to see, hinted at powers beyond their comprehension. And somewhere out there, the Proximans were no doubt already planning their next move. As the anesthesia began to take hold, Buff's last conscious thought was a silent promise to his team, to McDermott fighting for his life in the oar, and to all those who had fallen in this war. "We'll keep fighting. No matter what comes next, we'll face it together." The lights of the medical bay faded, and Major Sam Buff, leader of the Antimatter Marines, slipped into unconsciousness. The battle for Kepler 22 billion was over, but the war raged on. And the universe, vast and uncaring, held its breath, waiting to see what would emerge from the crucible of antimatter and human determination. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you loved it. Please remember to subscribe if you did like it so you can see more videos like this. And please give us a like and a comment too. I'll see you in the next one.